So it turns out there's this one weird trick to lowering the federal budget. The president can just refuse to spend everything. Yeah, sure, the legislature has the power of the purse and the president is obligated by the Constitution to faithfully execute the laws, but who cares? Certainly not President Trump. So he issued a 2-page memo that basically halts all federal grants and loans. This is a constitutional crisis. It's hard to overestimate how terrible this is. My voice sounds like this because I don't know what else to do. Okay, but actually, just kidding. On the day that we were planning to release this video, Trump changed his mind and rescinded the original memo with a one-liner memo. Probably because of the near unanimous backlash and a judicial stay. This is probably a tactic to try to moot all of the lawsuits, which we'll talk about. Except, just kidding again, because as we'll talk about, they admit they are rescinding the piece of paper, the OMB memo, but they are still doing the freeze. So that's fun, that definitely clarifies things. I am so done with these people, and there are 1,600 more days to go. American presidents generally are not kings. And I've been saying this a lot recently, but presidents don't get to pick and choose which laws they feel like following. And they generally must disperse money that Congress has lawfully allocated. And during Donald Trump's first term, he blatantly violated the law by withholding aid Congress had allocated to Ukraine. You might recall that President Trump, like a mafia boss, told Ukraine that they could have the money that Congress allocated if they did him a personal favor first, investigate Joe Biden's son. And the House of Representatives impeached Trump for this overreach. But Trump is back, and this time he has the architects of Project 2025 by his side. They envision a system where the president personally controls spending of the government. Trump and the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, Russ Vought, believe that the president has the right to withhold or impound funds allocated by Congress. On January 27th, Matthew J. Vaith, the acting director of the OMB, issued a 2-page memorandum freezing almost all federal grants and loans at home and abroad. The memorandum purports to stop the disbursements of hundreds of billions of dollars to programs. Before it was judicially halted and then rescinded by the Trump administration, the memo sent the government into complete chaos. And as just a sampling, it purported to stop the following projects and programs. All foreign aid except aid to Israel and Egypt. This includes the implementation of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, a government initiative launched in 2003 by President George W. Bush to combat the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. PrEPFAR is one of the most significant and impactful international health programs ever implemented, and it saved lives all over the world. And the Trump Organization had instructed organizations in other countries to stop dispersing HIV medications purchased with U.S. aid, even if the drugs had already been obtained and are sitting in local clinics. And missing even a few doses of an antiretroviral medicine can have life-threatening consequences. Additionally, money for Head Start, SNAP, WIC, Medicaid, and other domestic programs. The federal government warned Head Start that its money may come late or not at all because of potentially unallowable grant payments. WIC provides nutrition and other benefits to more than 50% of U.S. babies, and that includes tons of school lunch programs. All money for medical and scientific research in the US. The memo effectively stopped the NIH from funding new grant programs through its review groups called study sections. Without grants, the scientists are unable to start any new research on conditions from asthma to pediatric cancer to COVID and Ebola. The NIH awards more than 60,000 grants every year, supporting at least 300,000 researchers. And money to programs that help the elderly or veterans. Quote, the uncertainty right now is creating chaos for local Meals on Wheels providers, not knowing whether they should be serving meals today, which unfortunately means seniors will panic not knowing where their next meals come from. Additionally, veteran suicide prevention hotlines, Medicaid portals, and women's shelters. This is real supervillain stuff. The memo says the freeze is temporary, but we have no idea what that would mean. The memo says government employees who administer funds need to submit a list of projects suspended under the order by February 10th. And in true Soviet style, the memo orders the agencies to assign a political appointee to track the federal spending. And as we'll discuss, it's all for explicitly partisan reasons. Now, luckily, the memo excludes funds the government pays directly to individuals like Social Security benefits, and the next day they clarified it shouldn't apply to things like Medicaid, but the damage had been done. The original memo states that during their assessment, all federal agencies, quote, must temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance and other relevant agency actions that may be implicated by executive orders, including but not limited to financial assistance for foreign aid, non-governmental organizations, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. And the memo says it's done explicitly for the purpose of, quote, ending wokeness, as well as, quote, Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering. The always worth following Max Kennerly summarized, quote, the Trump admin declared war on Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering and lost so badly they capitulated in less than 48 hours. And the scope of paused funds include any implicated by the 6 executive orders issued by President Trump since January 20th. For example, Trump's order unleashing American energy paused the disbursement of funds under the Inflation Reduction Act that are directed toward alternative energy. These includes funds for electric vehicle charging stations made available through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program and the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program. Trump's order, quote, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing, provides for termination of all equity-related grants. This order would stop a wide range of grants and research projects connected to universities and federal agencies. The executive order, quote, protecting the American people against invasion, targets sanctuary cities and directs the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to review all contracts, grants, or other agreements providing federal funding to any organization supporting or providing services to immigrants without legal status. Trump's order on enforcing the Hyde Amendment purports to end the use of taxpayer funding to promote elective abortion, and the order defending women from gender extremism prohibits federal funds from being used, quote, to promote gender ideology. Each agency shall assess grant conditions and grantee preferences and ensure grant funds do not promote gender ideology. But clearly, with those 6 orders, President Trump was just getting started. Now, obviously, if you're going to try and defund the government, you'll want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've gotten in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you got one of those data breach letters saying your information might have been leaked, or dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. It's important to talk to a lawyer right away so you can maximize your recovery. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team, so click below. But let's cut right to the chase. This action is extremely illegal and unconstitutional. The Constitution gives Congress the exclusive power of the purse. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. And Article 2, Section 3 gives the president the power and the obligation to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Now, presidents have argued that the Take Care Clause gives the president the power to impound funds appropriated by Congress, but as we'll discuss, they have been unanimously shot down. But President Trump's actions set up a showdown between the legislative and executive branches to be determined by the third branch of government, the judiciary. So let's start with how the government funding actually works. Congress exercises its spending authority through the annual appropriations process. Congress allocates the budget expenditures throughout the government agencies, programs, and activities. And this is an oversimplification, but the executive branch is then responsible for dispersing those funds in accordance with Congress's instructions. As described by the Bipartisan Policy Center, quote, once Congress passes and the president signs into law an appropriations bill, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, within the executive office of the president, apportions funds to ensure federal agencies spend resources within their congressionally authorized and appropriated limits. Now, it's not unusual for presidents to seek more control over the budget process, but impoundment refers to the delay or withholding by the president of funds previously approved by Congress. These funds may have been appropriated by Congress, but not yet apportioned by OMB. Now, President Richard Nixon pushed the boundaries of what the executive branch could do with allocated funds. He frequently changed the funding levels or used different funding methods in order to exert control over Congress. During congressional hearings, members of Congress argued that impoundment allowed the president to modify and terminate programs without vetoing the whole appropriations bill, and therefore it was illegal. Now, President Nixon argued that the Take Care Clause imposed a duty on the president to consider whether the appropriations bills were consistent with the purposes of other laws. And this battle between Congress and the president came to a head when President Nixon tried to stop spending money to implement the Clean Water Act. In response, Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Now, the Constitution requires the president to spend the allocated money, but the ICA establishes a very limited process permitting the president to withhold funds through deferred spending or by asking Congress for a rescission. Now, a rescission is a permanent impounding or cancellation of the appropriated funds. Now, to implement a rescission, the president must submit a request to Congress explaining the reasons for canceling the funds, and Congress can refuse the president's rescission request. If Congress refuses, the funds must be spent as the Congress allocated them. Now here, as we'll talk about, Trump has made no such request, and the majority of the impounded funds wouldn't be subject to that process anyway. There's generally a lot more discretion to stop further contracts from being signed, but once the contracts are signed, the president can't stop the disbursement of funds, especially because they don't like the reasoning. Now, a deferral is a temporary impoundment or holding of appropriated funds. In a deferral, the president, through the OMB, sends a special message to Congress stating their intent to defer for a specific period of time. If either the House or Senate passes a resolution disapproving of the president's proposed deferral action, those funds must be released and made available for obligation. If there is no congressional action within 45 days of continuous session of Congress, the deferral stands. And the deferral of funds ends at the end of the fiscal year. But the deferral should be based on non-policy considerations. But here the OMB memo's justification, if you can call it that, for impoundment is that, quote, financial assistance should be dedicated to advancing administration priorities, and that the use of federal resources to advance Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies is a waste of taxpayer dollars that does not improve the day-to-day lives of those we serve. Now, I probably don't need to point this out, but laws that are passed support Congress's priorities, not the administration's. And in fact, all laws that have been passed predate this administration. The administration's priorities have nothing to do with congressionally passed laws. But additionally, the Impoundment Control Act exempts some appropriated funds from the impoundment procedure. Specifically, 2 U.S.C. 1661C states that the ICA's provisions do not apply to direct loan or loan guarantee programs that constitute an entitlement, such as the Guaranteed Student Loan Program or the Veterans Home Loan Guarantee Program, and include all existing credit programs of the Commodity Credit Corporation as of the enactment date of the title. The exemption means that the president cannot use the ICA's impoundment procedures to withhold or delay funds for these mandatory programs, as they are required to be disbursed according to the statutes governing them. Now, the Supreme Court has already weighed in on this. Despite the Nixon administration's efforts, all of its impoundment efforts were rebuked. For example, in Train versus City of New York, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the president does not have the unilateral authority to withhold funds that have been allocated by Congress through enacted legislation. Justice Byron White, writing for the court, emphasized that the statutory language of the law required the Clean Water Act funds to be distributed and did not give the executive branch discretion to reduce the amount of the disbursement. The ruling affirmed Congress's authority over federal spending and reinforced the principle of separation of powers. On the other hand, sometimes Congress can give discretion to the executive, but that doesn't happen all that often. Additionally, in 1996, President Bill Clinton signed the Line Item Veto Act, which purported to give the president the authority to cancel specific provisions in a law without vetoing the entire bill, basically allowing the president to strike out only certain portions. But the Supreme Court said that law was invalid. Quote, our first president understood the text of the presentment clause as requiring that he either approve all parts of a bill or reject it in toto. And in a 6-3 majority opinion written by Justice Stevens, the court ruled the Line Item Veto Act was unconstitutional. And the Office of Legal Counsel has twice affirmed that the Constitution does not give the president a broad impoundment right. In 1969, then Assistant Attorney General William Rehnquist wrote an OLC memo that said, quote, with respect to the suggestion that the president has a constitutional power to decline to spend appropriated funds, we must conclude that the existence of such a broad power is supported by neither reason nor precedent. And in 1998, the OLC issued another memo that reaffirmed this conclusion. Quote, there is no textual source in the Constitution for any inherent authority to impound. It has been argued that the president has such authority because the specific decision whether or not to spend appropriated funds constitutes the execution of the laws, and Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution vests the executive power in the president alone. The execution of any law, however, is by definition an executive function, and it seems an anomalous proposition that because the president is charged with the execution of the laws, he may also disregard the direction of Congress and decline to execute them. Similarly, reliance upon the president's obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Article 2, Section 3, to give the president the authority to impound funds in order to protect the national fisc, creates an anomalous result that the president would be declining to execute the laws under the claim of faithfully executing them. Moreover, if accepted, arguments in favor of an inherent impoundment power carried to their logical conclusion would render congressional directions to spend merely advisory. Now, contrary to all of this authority, in Project 2025, Russell Vought outlined his plan to push past the limits of executive power. Vought is Trump's nominee for OMB director. Vought argues that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. And in our Project 2025 video, Liz Dye says this.
Russ Vought is a self-described Christian nationalist who serves as the current policy director of the Republican National Committee. In 2016, he wrote that Muslims do not simply have a deficient theology, they do not know God because they have rejected Jesus Christ, his son, and they stand condemned. He believes we're living in a post-constitutional moment, and the only solution is to massively centralize power in the office of the president, conscripting the entire federal bureaucracy as a tool to reorder society in accordance with conservative values.
And now they've done exactly that. The ICA says that the president can defer spending of certain funds for 45 days after he makes a request to stop the funds. And a 2018 GAO legal opinion says that if the president proposes a rescission, he must make the affected funds available before the funds expire, even if the 45-day clock is still running. Now, Trump hasn't followed that process. He hasn't made a formal request to Congress about specific allotments, and the OMB is in chaos and can't produce a list of impacted programs. Right now, the Medicaid portal for all 50 states was taken down, denying benefits to 72 million people. And when asked about the Medicaid freeze, Trump's press secretary said she'd get back to the press later on what's going on. But following all of this chaos, and less than 24 hours later, the OMB tried to clarify that the federal aid freeze was expressly limited to programs implicated by the Trump executive orders. But a lot of the damage had already been done. Now, this wasn't politics as normal. This was not partisan politics. This wasn't the normal sort of testing the waters with executive orders that basically every president of the last 3 decades has done. This was something different. This was almost grinding the entire government to a halt based on policy preferences that this particular president doesn't like. And part of the reason that there was this detente among presidents to not do this kind of widespread impoundment, apart from, the text of the Constitution itself, is that the presidency tends to be temporary. And if you're a Republican with a Republican president, sure, it's all well and good that the president is refusing to enforce progressive or democratic laws, but that's only temporary because eventually a Democratic president will be elected. Does that mean that they're going to be cool with a Democratic president not enforcing any right-wing or conservative laws that have been already passed and are on the books? Now, none of that should matter because the president does not have the power to impound, and the Congress has the power of the purse. But even on policy grounds and even on just pure gamesmanship, you don't want the laws to be enforced based on who is currently president. And on top of that, House Republicans say that they're not concerned about Trump's actions. They stress that he's the God-King president and he gets to change the government spending priorities on his whim, apparently. For example, Representative Tom Cole said appropriations directed by Congress are not law. He said, quote, "I'm not a lawyer. I can't pontificate on what's legal, but I suspect what's happening is what most Republicans would be supportive of. Appropriations is not a law. It's a directive of Congress." And yeah, that statement is just insane. A written directive passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by a president is, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, the law. And Tom Cole is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. Yet he doesn't seem to think that Congress passes laws or that the president is bound by them. Luckily, several states impacted by Trump's memorandum immediately filed lawsuits challenging the actions. The National Council of Nonprofits and other groups filed a lawsuit in Washington, D.C., and the suit said, quote, "Given the few hours that remain before federal grantees are thrown into disarray, plaintiffs file this complaint and seek a temporary restraining order to maintain the status quo until the court has an opportunity to more fully consider the illegality of the OMB's actions." And just hours after the plaintiffs filed suit, the judge held an emergency status conference and granted plaintiffs a brief administrative stay while the government decides what it's actually doing. So thankfully, the governmental freeze is on freeze for a few days. And when asked what people should do who lost money or benefits because of the freeze, Trump's spokeswoman said that they should call Russ Vought and make their case.
I also spoke with the incoming director of OMB this morning, and he told me to tell all of you that the line to his office is open for other federal government agencies across the board. And if they feel that programs are necessary and in line with the president's agenda, then the Office of Management and Budget will review those policies. I think this is a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country, and it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
But all that's crazy because if the Nixon cases are any indication, all of this money will be appropriated and spent eventually. It's just going to come later rather than sooner. But right as we were planning to release this video, the Trump administration changed their mind and just said, oopsie, just kidding. In the barest of memos, the OMB said, quote, "OMB Memorandum M2513 is rescinded. If you have any questions about implementing the president's executive orders, please contact your agency general counsel." I do. I have some questions about implementing these insane orders. Question number 1, what were you thinking? Question number 2, how dare you? Now, this was probably in response to the tsunami of backlash. It turns out that many politicians like the programs that were halted, and many people literally rely on those programs to, live. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the thing about Chesterton fences is that someone put them there for a reason. But this is also likely an effort to evade the lawsuits that the administration would have surely lost. You can expect the Trump administration to try to do the same thing, but one program at a time. as they were doing originally on Trump's first day in office. And in fact, they actually admit that is exactly what they are doing. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt helpfully clarified that all the illegal stuff will still continue. Quote, "This is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze. It is simply a rescission of the OMB memo. Why? To end any confusion created by the court's injunction. The president's EOs on federal funding remain in full force and effect and will be rigorously implemented." So it's a naked play to stop the lawsuits, and the administration will still possibly freeze all of these programs, or perhaps only the woke ones. I don't actually know, but I'm not sure that they know either. But these lawsuits are not necessarily over anyway. While the original OMB memo is rescinded, at least the piece of paper is rescinded, you can expect the plaintiffs to argue that the case is still alive because of a standing exception where the case is capable of repetition but evading review. That requires that the challenged action is in its duration too short to be fully litigated prior to the cessation or expiration, and that there is a reasonable expectation that the same complaining party will be subjected to the same action again. But I don't even think that we need to get there, because the press secretary gave the plaintiffs a gift saying that the freeze is still in effect. This is just the latest in a series of extremely concerning moves of the Trump administration in its first week. And all these moves seek to consolidate executive power, install only partisan hacks and loyalists, and failing that, to just get the government to not function, including moves to fire all of the inspectors general, who are the watchdogs of the government, fire career staff, and rescind job offers to people who were looking to join the government, fire anyone at DOJ who was involved in the Trump prosecutions, require loyalty oaths for new hires, firing 2 NLRB members without cause, issuing a hiring freeze on almost anything except for law enforcement, and now just stopping to allocate funds. But make no mistake about it, this is a constitutional crisis. And yet this story will fail to reach millions of Americans because of media bias or attempts to avoid bias. A staggering 565 news outlets are covering the impoundment crisis, yet over 85% of the coverage comes from center and left-leaning sources, leaving less than 15% coming from the right. That disparity alone is telling. And when you examine the headlines, you see very different frames emerge that shape how readers interpret and understand the events that are unfolding. Of the few right-leaning sources that covered this story, we see partisan headlines like "Dems cry foul," "Schumer loses it," describing Trump's actions as part of a shock and awe administration, leaving Democrats scrambling. Left-leaning sources focused on groups and programs directly affected, including killing innocent Americans, as we see in this headline about food and water safety programs, or costing Ohio $18 billion. And the sources in the center reported the story by examining the damage, such as halting $700 million for Louisiana schools, or putting SNAP benefits under direct threat. Now, the headlines that you read first have immense power to shape how you understand the news, and that's why I like to see the news from as many angles as I can, which I can with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. And right now they're offering Legal Eagle viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. You can scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get the discount for a limited time. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For any story, you can see the coverage details and political bias. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, where there's no telling who owns it or what the agenda might be. I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum, like this story about impoundment, which the right-leaning sources largely ignored. It helps explain why we often talk past each other, and some people seem hyper-focused on what seems like nonsense, often because some random blog post went viral among a certain group of people. Ground News is my favorite way to get the news. And as a Legal Eaglet, you can save 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and Blind Spot feed. And by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So click on the link below or scan the code today. And after that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.